Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the first session on day 2 of the M&H Summer Series. I can see that some of you are people who joined us yesterday, and so I'm very sorry to go through the same housekeeping that I always go through. As you all know, you just pop your microphones on mute, and I'll pass over in any minute now to Rachel, who's going to introduce everyone. The speakers will be talking for the lion's share of the session. And then any questions you have, if you pop them in the chat with your name and organization, we'll go through those at the end. So that is all from me, and I'll hand over now to Rachel. Take it away.
That's brilliant. Thank you, David. Dan, could you start to share the slides? Well, yes, on it. Already started. I'll start by introducing myself and we'll get the slides up. So my name is Rachael Lennon. For the past 5-6 years, I've been leading the Inclusive Histories work at the National Trust. Which included curating Prejudice and Pride, their big LGBTQ+ programme in 2017. From that role, I was involved in founding the Queer Heritage and Collections Network, and I actually left the Trust earlier in the year, but I've still been very involved in running the network with Dan across the rest of the year. So we actually have 3 speakers with us today. Dan, if you flick through the next 2 slides. Thank you. Yeah, this is the 3 of us you'll be hearing from. Dan, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thank you very much, Rachel. Hello, everyone. I'm the other co-project manager of the Queer Heritage Collections Network. I'm Dan Vo. I've been with us from the start, and you may have seen me floating around, haunting other collections such as the V&A Museum and other museums around the country, sort of looking at queer history and heritage. So it's a delight to be here with you today as well. And then Khris, hello.
Yeah, hello. My name's Khris Reid. I am a PhD student at Ulster University. I'm researching museum engagement with queer identity in Northern Ireland specifically. And I'm also an independent researcher for the network. So I worked alongside Richard Sandell last year, to write a literature review on all the lovely academic stuff that's been going on in the sector as well.
Brilliant. Thank you both. Yeah, so Dan, if you flick to what we'll be talking about, we'll be talking for just probably over around half an hour between the 3 of us. We're going to leave a lot of time for Q&A at the end, so please do, as David says, as we go, note your questions down, stick them in the chat, and we can have a bit of a discussion at the end. So I'm going to kick off with some background to the network, how it emerged, where it came from. Before handing over to Dan, he will talk about membership, so who are our members, what are they asking for? And Dan will also talk a little bit about what we've delivered so far, so where the efforts of the network have been over the last couple of years, year and a bit. And then we'll hand over to Khris, who, as he says, will talk about the academic research that's gone on as part of the network's work. And then it'll come back to me to do a few minutes looking forward, so thinking about the future of the network in the next couple of years before we get into the Q&A. So yeah, stick your questions in the chat, that would be great. And Dan, if we flick through. So I thought I'd start by going back to 2017, which feels like 5 minutes ago in some ways, but actually it's a few years now. But it was a big moment for the sector in terms of LGBTQ representation. And I'm sure lots of you will remember that 2017 was the 50-year anniversary of the partial decriminalisation of same-sex acts in England and Wales. And the anniversary just really seemed to capture the imagination of the sector at that time. And it built on all the amazing work that LGBT History Month had been doing, fantastic projects across the sector. But it really created new opportunities, and I think really crucially kind of opened doors that had previously been closed to this kind of work right in the sort of mainstream heart of the sector. So there's lots of amazing new content that year exploring past queer lives, as well as new efforts to welcome queer audiences, LGBTQ+ audiences, into our spaces at that time. So some of the big nationals, the sort of big names we didn't before then associate with this kind of work, he'd maybe flirted with the idea of LGBTQ+ engagement before, but had never really committed to it. At least in 2017, we saw them programme some real blockbuster exhibitions and activity. So at the top left image here, you'll see the Tate exhibition, Queer British Art. Historic Royal Palaces programmed a fantastic event called Long Live Queer James, which is the lovely image top right. National Trust, obviously my programme, we programmed Prejudice and Pride. You can see one of our National Trust teams at London Pride in the bottom right. And one of my favourite images of the programme, top centre, which is the back-to-backs in Birmingham during their Pride activities. So lots of organisations sort of reached into their LGBTQ archives and collections and looked at them in a new way in that year and reached out to new audiences through those programmes. And so as the year went on, as the build up to the year emerged, and we started to deliver activity, a few sort of very informal networks popped up across the sector for some of us who were running this activity to support each other as it was happening. And it was brilliant. There was a real buzz around it at the time. And then at the start of 2018, I worked with Richard Sandell at the University of Leicester, who Khris has already mentioned, I'm sure will come up a couple of times, to programme a conference, a 2-day international conference, exploring LGBTQ+ collections, heritage and engagement. Sorry, I'm really struggling with hay fever today. And so during that conference, the demand from the sector for more support around this work was incredibly clear. So people wanted more guidance, more case studies, more time to think about this work, more opportunities to connect with other people who were thinking about it and programming really exciting stuff. There is a very small, very, very active network of amazing people who explore queer heritage and collections quite a lot, to give a lot of their time to it. But in 2018, I felt like there was a sense that elsewhere in the sector, the sort of priorities had shifted, the programmes had shifted. You know, same people who might be looking at this work start to look at the suffrage anniversary, other anniversaries, thinking about new work. And there was a bit of a moment of risk of, you know, is some of this momentum going to die out in some of these areas? So if we skip slide that, Dan, that'd be great. Oh, back one. I think we've wanted, yeah, Brill, thanks. Yeah, so the network emerged in that context, I think, with that awareness from that fantastic year and from a number of very informal conversations. So Dan was involved right at the start. I had a conversation with Richard Sandell from Leicester, Matthew Story from Historic Royal Palaces at the British Museum Diversity Conference at the end of 2019. I know that there was a conversation at Strawberry Hill. There was just a sense that there is an opportunity for something to happen here. And so at the National Trust, we were really lucky enough to be in a position of working with a researcher called Lucy Whitehead, who was doing a research project in the Southeast, and said, yep, I'll give you my time to help draft a bid to help bring this network to life. So we pulled together representatives from the founding partners you can see here. So English Heritage, Historic England, Historic Royal Palaces, National Trust and RCMG. And we pulled together a small group of founding partners. And it was this collection that wrote the first bid with Lucy to the Art Fund to ask for a small grant to kickstart something, with this idea that, you know, there's some potential here. What can we do with this? Dan, if you want to flick to the next slide. So this small group of very enthusiastic people from very big organisations drafted these aims of what a network might be. And I actually went back to the original Art Fund bid for this to think about, you know, where did we start, what we were saying that we would look at. And these were out of the 5 aims that we set out. So the first one, we knew we would need funding. Again, we had a small grant, which was brilliant, but was for setup. It wasn't going to sustain us in the long term. Extend membership beyond the 5 founding partners. There was never an intention that this would be a partnership of a few organisations. It was always intended to be open to any practitioner, any UK practitioner doing this work, looking at LGBTQ+ heritage and collections. And then we wanted to research the needs of the sector in relation to these themes, to share best practice and build confidence. That really came from, for me, that really came from that conference that we did. There was so much demand for that. And then to provide peer support And I think so those top two aims are really just about being able to do the work. They're about kind of setup and sustainability. The last three there are what we actually wanted the network to do. And Dan and Khris are going to talk a little bit about the research so far and how we've been sharing best practice and building confidence so far. Peer support is something that I think we'll be looking to step up in this next phase of the project, so in the next couple of years. And I think peer support's really crucial for what we want to do with the network. It's always been at the heart of the vision of the network. And I said that I think some of the roots of our work lie in the 2017 programming, and I'm sure that lots of you will be aware that that wasn't always smooth sailing for everyone involved in it. And obviously from my perspective, running the program at the National Trust, the Prejudice and Pride was all over right-wing press in the kind of early days of the culture wars. For weeks, you know, the idea that we were outing people from the past, we were tying up volunteers and rainbow lanyards, and like obviously none of which was true, but was quite challenging. And I think even internally in the organisation, there was resistance to this kind of work, and talking to other people running work like this in very established museums. I think many of us faced opposition, were exposed to, you know, sometimes homophobia, really difficult, challenging things that could be quite draining. And I think certainly my experience was that it was external people who were best positioned to help and support me with that, and to encourage me and push me and enable me to sort of keep going, to make the changes that needed to be made. So I think peer support's really crucial for that network. And yeah, so this is where we started, these sort of 5 aims, and the network is evolving. It's very organic. As the membership grows and shifts, the aims of the network will grow and shift, will continue to evolve. And as Dan will tell you, the membership has grown. And so I'll hand over to Dan to talk to you a bit more about who our members are and how that picture's changed from this starting point.
Thank you very much, Rachel. I just wanted to pick up on a word that you used, which I rather liked, which was a flirtation with queer history, which I think if we're going to talk about that, I get to talk about the intercourse now, I think is where I'm going to go with it, which is, you know, I just wanted to pull up just 4 brilliant examples from the founding members. And for me, what makes it really exciting and encouraging and makes me really enthusiastic about the work that's happening is here's just an example of 4 sort of highlights of key projects that have been done. There was Dave McAlmont going into the National Trust collections to dig up stories, to share queer stories. We've got a wonderful piece that you'll see. This is top right now. You'll see at the very end. We're going to show you a clip from Our House from English Heritage. And then you've got the work that was done by Historic England to map out, you know, queer Britain. What does that look like? You know, what were the key moments? What were the key people in our history? And then you've got down at the bottom right as well, this wonderful interpretation of the LGBTQ plus lives of the people who lived in the Tower. So that's Historic Royal Palaces. And for me, what's really exciting is here are 4 key projects, and it just happens that as part of the ethos of the building of these wonderful projects, the stories of queer people of color and Black people are just part of it as well. And just part of it as well is just also there's great representation for non-binary and trans voices as well. So I think for me, the intersectionality of the way that we look at it is really interesting and really exciting. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about the network in sort of a way to kind of help you understand how we can help you further. I think that Rachel's already kind of mapped it out quite clearly. And here is a wonderful map of about 75 organizations now that are across the whole of the UK. We work really hard to make sure that it is for regions and nations and that we are representing as much as we can. There is obviously a lot of representation from England right now. So if you are from Northern Ireland, Scotland, Wales, we deeply welcome you to join the network. It is free, and you know, you've got a wonderful researcher like Khris based out in Northern Ireland. You've got Lucy, who Rachel's already mentioned, based out in Wales as well. So we've got, you know, we've got people embedded in strategically, but it would be great to see more support, because the more people there are, I think that really that idea where Rachel wants us to kind of peer support each other and support each other in the work that we do, I think it's going to be a lot easier to do. And I think that's the sort of the touching onto the idea of what are the barriers, because as part of this induction that we do with each of the new incoming members, the 75 members, I've done around about 63 interviews with each of them to kind of find out what it is that's on their mind. And so on one hand, we're looking at what are the barriers. On the other hand, what are the things that would really help them with what they need to do in their organization. And, you know, we recognize that the organizations are very different. We've got local authority collections through to big nationals. And we've also got collections that are quite early on, you know, they're starting that flirtation. The other organizations that have been involved in this for a long time. And so what are the barriers to what the work that they're doing at the different stages that they're at? And I think that it helped us to kind of corral them into sort of 3 key areas. And these are the areas. It was to look at the engagement and the programming. So that's working directly with the audiences. And then behind the scenes, it was to look at the way that things are collected and the way that things are cataloged, the way that things are sort of being able to hold the research that is being done around these objects or these histories, and then looking at how we can make sure that they are shared across organizations as well, so that we're not operating in silos. And so if you're doing a piece of work around somebody that's important and you find something really exciting and new, it is able to go into other collections and be shared as well. And that sharing idea, I think, really is an important part of just trying to break down those regional and national barriers, those boundaries, but also to kind of break down the barriers between collections as well and between organizations. Things that I think on the bigger picture is being worked out by other projects and organizations as well. So for us, tapping into those other projects and organizations is really important as well. But the key themes that emerge, the 12 themes that emerge, is just a lot of text on a screen right now for you. But I think that it really helped define what we did in those first sort of 12 months, I suppose. We've just gone past that first year. And we were born in the middle of COVID. We were given funding just as everyone went into lockdown. So it's sort of really amazing to me to think that we found 75 members, and we're still continuing to grow members as well. Museums Heritage, when we received the award recently, thank you very much, for Best Partnership. Already people have been reaching out to join up as well. So, and it is free. So it is great to sort of see that, you know, there are organizations out there that are still trying to get in touch with us. But these are the things that we will look to support you on with your projects and your work in your organization. So Rachel's already mentioned that idea of the call for a case of studies and to understand each other's issues and to help each other learn from each other's work in the past, and to try and kind of, you know, if you hit a particular hurdle, there will be an organization that has overcome that before. And so being able to help you link up with the right person or the right organization is certainly something that's at the heart of what our network is about. Collections labeling, I think we've kind of touched on, you know, where do the things that you are collecting that are LGBTQ plus significant, where do they go? What are the terms? Co-curation training is something that really bubbled up to the surface. Lots of organizations started off thinking that, you know, they'll get a grant, they'll start the work, they'll appoint the right people, but it was about emotional preparedness as well. And it was not just the emotional preparedness of the staff member. You know, you have to really connect with the community. You have to really invest yourself into it. It was also about the emotional preparedness of the receiving audience as well, and making sure that that trust is really strongly established, and at all times that trust is maintained. Decolonizing, I think, is something that we kind of touched on a little bit earlier with the demonstration of, you know, the stories of people of color and Black people as well. And I think that it's something that I'll demonstrate in an exhibition that I'll just point out in just a moment. But there are overlays between the idea of how colonial anti-homosexual laws spread around the world and has affected our understanding of gender and sexuality. I think embedding comes down to a really important part, which is that idea of, you know, we talked about 2017, what remains after 2017? If we're looking at a project today, what remains after what we do today? And I'll quickly just go through some of the next few points, because there's quite a few, but engagement, I think, is really important. How do you do that? Evaluation, how do we make sure that what we do is fairly evaluated and we make sure that we are making an impact, that we are leaving a legacy behind? Interpretation is really interesting, because for me, it's about working with communities, strongly working with communities. And I think that this is a part that, as part of the network, you know, we're going to be really keenly focused on to make sure that it is about that community input as well, and how your research can tie in together. Networking, I think we are a network. That's what we're all about. We're about getting you introduced to other people that are interested in the areas of the project that you're working on. Mentoring is really important. Rachel, I think, you know, that's something that you are really pushing for and is really at the heart of what you want to achieve with this network. training, I think, seems a little bit obvious now, but I think coming to values, I think that's what is really important, because it is about knowing when to make a statement, the way to do that well, and then holding on to that statement and being guided by that statement, it being always at the core of what you do. So the values being really important, because as I said before, is about that trust. You know, the trust is so fragile. And so being able to monitor that and hold on to that, I think it comes back to your values of exactly what you want to achieve. And then updates, I think people just want to know what each other are doing. And so I think for us, being able to corral those 12 thoughts, those 12 key themes into what became our first symposium was a really important part of defining that program, of working on I think it was 7 sessions you can see here that sort of gave an idea of what each of the organizations did and are doing that can really support and inspire you as well. And if you kind of just search for hashtag QHCN 2021, you'll be able to find all the videos on YouTube as well. So there are some brilliant sessions out there. And there's also a program as well, which I can make sure that MNH will have the program and share that around as well, because it's a great resource to be able to use and refer to as well, especially if you're starting out. There's a little section in there that kind of gets you with ideas for what to do. And then if you're a little bit more deeply engaged, there's Chris's wonderful literature review as well, which he'll come to in just a moment. But I think that symposium was really an exciting moment for us, because suddenly there was this rush of voices being able to, really expert voices, really wanting to share their experiences and what they've learned in the process of making their projects with everybody. So, you know, Rachel, I always like to throw in this quote because it's because I get to show off your wonderful T-shirt as well. But, you know, I think for me, it all comes down to this, you know, what are the values? It comes down to this for me as a statement, which is, you know, it's our responsibility to continue to look again, to research, to better understand the lives lived in connections to the different places and the objects that we have in our collections, and ask who's remembered and who's forgotten, and to understand the power behind those choices, understand that we've got the power to change that as well, to make change happen. So, you know, Rachel's words are always very inspiring to me. And I wanted to just quickly bring in an exhibition that, you know, you can go to right now and have a look at, that brings in sort of all of these ideas into a really, really powerful way. And so if you go to Oxford, if you're able to get to Beyond the Binary, I think that's a wonderful example. And the team did present at our symposium idea of how you can bring a lot of those ideas of co-curation and really shift power, really ask who is in control of the project as well. So that's Beyond the Binary in Pitt Rivers at Oxford University. So that was me. That's the symposium that we had, and I think that was a key moment in our organisation. I'm delighted to say that now that Heritage Fund have come forward to support us in addition to Art Fund, it means that we'll now have a symposium in 2022 and 2023 confirmed as well. So there'll be another opportunity to explore these fantastic ideas that's bubbling around our sector. So I now hand over to Khris, who is going to give you a bit of a more detail about that literature review.
Thanks, Dan. And yeah, as Dan said, this is something that is available, and I guess kind of touching on some of the points that Rachel made as well, I really hope that the literature review can allay any fears or concerns that people might have that you're doing this alone. That a lot of people have had these same barriers, different pathways that they've taken, and I think that that consistently comes up in the literature. But I guess just to dive into it, this was a piece of work that I did alongside Professor Richard Sandell, who is the co-director of the Research Centre for Museums and Galleries at the University of Leicester. And basically, we wanted to collate the existing academic literature on the subject of LGBTQ+ or queer museum practice and tease out the main themes that emerge in that. And as Rachel said, again, 2017 was such a huge year for queer practice in our heritage sector. And that's very much reflected again in the literature. I mean, the literature has grown exponentially in the past decade or two. But since 2017, we've seen more and more work emerging, which is really, really exciting. So I hope what we've done is pulled together a useful document that when you read through it, it can inform the work that you might do if you were to engage in this kind of practice. Because it highlights a number of the key successes that people have experienced doing this work, but it also pulls out some of the challenges that people face as well. And I think by doing that, we can create a pathway to overcoming some of those challenges, or certainly making it easier for the people who come after us as well. So I'll just go to the first slide. there were two overarching themes that emerged in the literature review that we wanted to drill into in a bit more detail. So the first looked at interpreting LGBTQ plus history and queering museum collections. And this focuses on the specific approaches museums have taken to queer their collections and practices. And within this, as you can see, there were a number of sub-themes that emerged. So the first was overcoming the queer language barrier, which is one that comes up consistently. And this focuses on the search for the correct or appropriate use of language when discussing this group, which, to be honest, doesn't yet have a definitive answer. But there are multiple approaches that people can take. And I think what we find is that as long as there's a consistency in approach, then that's the best way to go. The second looked at queer intersectionality, and this calls for a more nuanced approach to queer curatorship that better explores the diversity of queer lived experiences, which I know Dan talked about there, and really lovely, with some really lovely examples as well. So not just looking at the white cisgender upper classes, essentially, which I know is something I've been guilty of in my own research. So it's really about, I suppose, untying those fixed narratives that some of us are all guilty of doing. The third one looked at representations of queer women in museum display. And this highlights the particular challenge faced by museums when attempting to engage with the history of queer women, not least of all the dominance of male perspectives in the historical record and the erasure of women more generally in the museum space. The fourth that came out really strongly was around deconstructing heteronormativity and homonormativity. So heteronormativity refers to that ingrained assumption that every individual or every object associated with them that visitors will encounter in the museum is heterosexual or cisgender unless evidence is presented to the contrary. Whilst homonormativity enforces this perceived ideal of what queer identity should look like, which again is influenced by the dominance of heterosexuality and cis identities in our society. The fifth one looked at queer collections development and queering existing collections. So this unpicks some of the routes towards interpreting and publicly presenting queer lives. And it's a really interesting section. I really enjoy reading about it because there have been so many methods that have been utilized for it. And the last one looked at trans voices. And within the literature on queer museum practice, trans voices are quite often forgotten, or they're certainly minimized. And I can't remember who said it, but there's that quote where somebody says the T in LGBT is often silent. And I think that still applies to some of the literature on this subject. So hopefully we'll see a bit more growth in that way. So this section really seeks to address the need for museums to react, in particular to the growing social and political oppression faced by transgender people specifically. So that's why we really looked at it as a separate point, because it's not just within the museums, but as we know, there are so many much wider political and cultural influences on what we do as well. So if you can go to the next slide, Dan. The second overarching theme we looked at was queer heritage in the public realm. And this looks at how these interpreted LGBTQ plus stories and themes are presented and received by both visitors and the wider population, and also how these narratives are discussed in the public realm. And again, Rachael alluded to the culture wars we're seeing now. This is something that I think is just going to become part of the practice, is learning how to approach these types of situations. But the first one we looked at was UK regional particulars. And as somebody from Northern Ireland, this was very, very special to me, and is one of the reasons I'm such a huge advocate of this network, because much of the literature discussing the UK in particular tends to generalize the experience of all four of the nations within the UK, and even the smaller regions within that. I mean, I'm even guilty of generalizing England as one place, but England is huge compared to places like Northern Ireland, and there are variances on the experiences of a museum in Liverpool to one in Aberdeen to one again in Derry. And I think that's something that perhaps needs a little bit more work in the literature, but I think that this network is really leading the way in making sure that that takes place, which is very, very exciting. The second one looked at LGBTQ plus rights advocacy and activism. And this this is a really, really important one, I think. And this is one I think some museums maybe are still a bit nervous about. It's about taking a position on certain political or perceived to be political subjects. Essentially what we're arguing for, what the literature argues for, is the need for museums to actively challenge social and political injustice, and particularly for the oppressed minority groups that we serve. In this instance, museums 100% have the capacity to not merely represent a marginalized group, but to actively advocate for their rights. And instead of taking a neutral position on a subject that might be deemed, as I said, too political, we can instead stand firm in our support for human rights in particular. Third was organizational resilience and values. And this goes back again to what Dan and Rachel said about peer support, that often you need somebody from outside to drive you forward. Because sometimes within the organization, you as an individual might have to be quite resilient, but also the literature is calling on the organizations themselves to be resilient and to support their staff members and to stand firm, because the work that we do, if it's done correctly, will be ethically informed. It will have been well thought out. And despite the negative press or the negativity that might come both internally and externally, when you're doing this work, an organization should be supporting what has been created. And finally, trans voices again, and we put these into both of the wider themes because we really felt, particularly at the moment, there is a real need to address the absence of trans voices in our museums. And as I said, in the literature as well. And there's a lot of work to be done across the sector when it comes to queer lives generally. But we certainly need to do more to interpret and advocate trans voices more effectively. So this section of the literature review really delves into that and kind of what that could look like. And that's it. I mean, it was a really exciting opportunity to work on this literature. As I said, a lot of it has only been written in the past number of years. I couldn't keep up with some of the publications that were coming out, so that I'm sure there are many that have been done even since we finished this that aren't in there. I think in a way I'd like this to be a working document where we can still add more of those publications to that. But as Dad said, it's readily available, so if anybody wants to read it, please do. So I'll hand back over to Rachel.
Thank you. That was brilliant. Yeah, and it just coming back, just listening to you talk about it again, having not heard you speak about it for a few months, it reminds me that we are really keen to have a very research active network in the long term. There's so much potential in that area. That's great. Thank you. And my voice has come back a bit more, so that's also good. So I'm going to look forward briefly over the last couple of minutes. And just, I suppose, reflecting on that we've had a brilliant year so far. So, we started the symposium. It was fantastic to win the Partnership Award a couple of weeks ago. And just a couple of months ago, we were awarded £100,000 from the Heritage Fund. You can see we've added to our logos here at the top right for the next 2 years to continue our activity. And there's going to be 2 strands to that activity in the next couple of years. So Dan, could you flick to the next slide, please? So one strand is around sustaining the network. And that's really about the core activity that we want the network to always do. It's the stuff that's really at the heart of what we were trying to do when we set it up. The network's run by a fantastic small team of freelancers. But it's really important just for that coordination, just to keep us alive and going, to have some time, basically, to invest in the network. And then it also will allow us to program some more regular catch-ups for members, and that's sort of speaking to that peer support that we touched on, and launch digital comms, which will be a fantastic platform for some of sharing of the case studies and some of the research that's ongoing. So we've been quite keen to do that all the way through and just not had capacity yet. So this funding will help us all unlock that next step. And then, as Dan sort of highlighted, Dan smashed the symposium at the start of the year when you pulled it together. And we had fantastic feedback, and there is clearly demand for events like that. So yeah, we've got funding for another 2 symposiums, one next year, one the following year. And I would just echo what Dan said around if you are interested in this area and you did miss the symposium in January, have a Google. Everything was recorded, Dan's posted everything onto YouTube. Have a look. There's a lot of good stuff there, a lot of inspiration, certainly, if you're looking for that sort of thing in your work. And then the second strand of activity that the Heritage Fund have provided us grants for is a project around digital engagement that we're calling Tagathons and Creatathons. And it's going to be an opportunity to work with up to 5 museums to support them to work with local community groups to better understand the queer connections within their collections, and then to continue to work with community groups to create some kind of new digital engagement activity. So it really is that kind of testing best practice, new practice across the sector. Now, because of the lottery funding, we're able to offer expertise, so someone to come with experience in this kind of work to support the organisation through that process, as well as funding, so small grants of £1,000 to £3,000 to fund that activity, potentially to be some kind of match funding, to escalate it, to make sure that funding isn't a barrier for the right organisation or the right teams and communities to be doing that work. So it's very exciting to be able to offer that into the sector. I think that's something we've obviously been wanting to do, but not had the chance to do until this grant was successful. So if you're interested in this kind of work, if you're sitting in an organisation, you think, oh, this could work for us, then do make sure that you join the network and keep an ear out for opportunities towards the sort of the end of this year, start of next year, to take place probably next calendar year. And Dan, if you flick to the next slide, this is how you'll do that. So if you are interested in our work, to get in touch and to join, probably the simplest thing is to email Dan. There's Dan's email address right at the bottom there. As we go into this new stage of the network and set up more regular comms, really step up our comms, it's likely that we're going to be going through a GDPR process in the next sort of few weeks, months. I know I can see Dan hanging his head. It's not the fun bit you get into this for, but it's really important. So if you get in touch with Dan, send her an email, then we can keep you updated and send you sort of a more formal invitation to join in the next few months, and you can get the newsletters and regular comms from us. So we just want to end, if you flick one more, Dan, with something a bit more inspirational than GDPR, with this fantastic, really short film, it's only a minute long, of one of the projects of our founding partners, English Heritage. It's a fantastic theatre piece. We showcase this at the symposium. If this inspires you to learn more, do look up the symposium section. We previewed this film at the symposium and had some of the fantastic people involved in creating it come and talk about their experience. And I think this is just a really good example of the kind of work we're looking to support through the network, we're looking to create through the network, and we're looking to promote through the network. So Dan, if you want to hit play.
We are making a new piece of theatre that celebrates and uncovers the hidden queer history that is located at Eltham Palace.
I want to create a piece of theatre which makes the people that feel like English heritage sites aren't for them. It's actually their right to be there, because these sites, they are designed for us and by us.
It's owning the queer stories that came with this site, the unspoken story. Queerness is a celebration.
We have to create those conversations. These real life people were never heard, and it feels like it's our responsibility to finally give them a voice and to empower ourselves to have our own voices.
Brilliant, thank you. So that's it from us. So if you do have any questions, put them in the chat. I think, David, you might have a couple for us as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was brilliant. Just to give people a chance, because I think quite a few people have probably been making notes. So if you want to pop the questions in the chat, please do. And also, it's probably worth mentioning, this session has been recorded, so it will be uploaded in the coming weeks. And when we upload that, we'll put links to all the resources and the literature that's been mentioned. So hopefully it'll be a one-stop shop for all those things. One of the things I just wanted to ask was, because I think all of you sort of alluded to it, in your different areas of the talk was to do with whether it's the right-wing press, whether it's on social media, the sort of attacks some museums and heritage organisations either have been subjected to or feel they might be subjected to. How do you think they can sort of arm themselves to deal with that when I suppose it sort of inevitably happens, is the sad reality, isn't it? What would your advice be from the network of how they could sort of feel more confident?
Shall I take this one? Given my experience, there's a few things. I suppose one of the things we were saying there is about no individual and no organization feeling isolated, and I think that is really, really important. Nobody is alone in going through this. No one should feel attacked and that they don't have a huge support network around them. I think that is really important. The network can help with that, but even, you know, there are lots of informal networks that that already exist out there, and it just, you know, keeping an eye on what's happening in the sector and being externally facing and seeing the wonderful activity out there is really positive, I think, and really sort of reassuring. And for us, in my experience, working in partnership is also really empowering. In your kind of you've got each other's backs and you're sort of sharing that work and sharing any risk in it. So there's something about that I think the network can help with. So a couple of other things that I think are worth bearing in mind. And one is that it's about values. I think, Dan, you mentioned that, around like who we are as an organisation, who we are as a sector, what we're here to do. In the quote that Dan put up from my article, which is in a Prejudice and Pride publication, which is another resource that we can share with you. I'm talking about it's our responsibility to look again. We've been given these collections and places, and if we don't challenge the established narratives that we have inherited, then we are not fulfilling that responsibility. So there is something that's really in the core of who we are and what we do that should be empowering us all to do that work. And I think a lot of the resistance that we see, it comes from this idea that, you know, the version of history that we've all inherited is neutral and true, and any deviation from that is political, and we shouldn't be doing that. And we all know that that is not the case, that we've all inherited a lot of bias in our interpretation, in our collections, in our understanding of history, and we need to unpick that. And even as I'm saying that, I think that sort of speaks to some of the stuff Khris was saying, that there is a lot of academic rigor behind this work as well that you can pull on, that you're not just, it's not a sort of a thing of today, and it's not a sort of shallow political statement. There is this academic rigor behind it that you can lean on. Yeah, and I think they're the sort of the really key things. I suppose the last thing I'd say is just that when you're being challenged, it's just about knowing why you are doing what you're doing and why you're making the choices that you are, so that you can keep going back to that and keep sticking to that, because it is the right thing to do.
Thank you for that, Rachel. We have a question from Manasi at History Speak. He says, with regards to the intersectionality of decolonization and LGBTQ+, how did the network address or advise on the historic and present role of religion?
I'm happy to take that one on, because I think it connects to a few projects that I've been working on. One with Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, so it's a very ethnographical collection. Pit Rivers Beyond the Binary, and also just one down the road with Guernsey Park Museum. I think for me, it's always important to try and connect with the community so that they are speaking from the community. So for us, I think, you know, we have reached out to and connected up with, and slowly we've not only involved them, but they've actually become part of our, so the different museums that I'm talking about now, they've become part of the organization, either through volunteering or something a little bit more deeper. So I think for us to reach out to people who are from, you know, a particular religion, who are also LGBTQ+, and being able to connect with them. And there are lots of great groups out there that are either, you know, based all around the country. And for me, kind of being able to match up, you know, the different groups together as well is really important. So I think as an example, we had Morge Anjum, who is one of the trustees at Queer Britain, also is a director of Imam, who look at, you know, sort of LGBTQ+ Muslim communities. And I think being able to talk with more and sort of connecting up with the right project to the right person who can sort of help voice different interpretation labels or help actually run the workshops with the communities, I think is a really important part of that. So I think really being able to connect deeply with that community and wherever possible, trying to make sure that, you know, it is from that community as well, so that the connection is true, I think, in my mind. So I think that that's a you know, there's lots of organizations out there that you can connect up with to help to make your project really, you know, get a good lens from all those different layers. I don't know if there's anybody else who wants to contribute to that. Just, I think just to add to the answer, Rachel, that David, you asked about, you know, how do we prepare for it? I think we, Rachel, we learned from what happened at the National Trust as well in 2017. And many of the organizations that I've ended up doing lots of queer history with, we have often emotionally prepared the volunteers for it as well. So what happens if, you know, the press does happen? You know, how do you, how are you prepared, you know, to, you know, I suppose not take it personally, but also if you want to kind of, you know, make sure that it's you make your statement, you can do so as well. I think that recently there was a right-wing press trying to get the National Trust again by sort of saying, oh, rainbow face painting. But I think what was brilliant was Hilary McGrady kind of came out and said, this is actually not a, this is not a true story. You know, you've just kind of sort of made a, you made a false statement out of, you know, what is actually a genuinely wonderful approach to the community to say, come, families come and have this wonderful day with us at our property. So I think that was really a great thing to sort of see from the very top as well. So I think that the idea, Rachel, of you sort of saying that across the organization, once you've established those values, everybody will be able to toe the line with where they believe and what they believe the true intent of that organization, of the project is, I think is a really important part of being able to shoulder weather that any negativity.
That is great. Thank you so much for that, Dan. I mean, I had written several questions before the session, but you've all given such detailed presentations that I've actually sort of, they've been answered throughout. I don't think there are any more questions in the chat at the minute. So I think we're getting near the end of the hour anyway. I think obviously I second what you said. Everyone should go and watch the symposium on YouTube. And I'm sure plenty of us that are here today will be tuning in for the next one next year. But oh no, we have a question. So this is from Hannah at the National Museum of the Royal Navy. How do you go about convincing your organisation and volunteers that this is something worth getting on board with, particularly if they are of an older generation who grew up with different views?
Shall I start, and then I'm sure that we can all kind of contribute to that. I think one of the lessons that we learned was around involving volunteers from as early as possible a stage, and creating very active routes into volunteer involvement. So we had a project at Kingston Lacey in Dorset that was sort of just building up and sort of ramping up to launch just as the press hit, and there was a bit of a wobble and the National Trust like, oh, is this right, is this all going to go ahead? And actually it was one of the most successful projects that we ran, and I think that was really down to how early and how deeply the volunteers were engaged in what we were doing. And so some of it, I think, goes back to what I was saying before about just understanding why you're doing what you're doing and being able to articulate that and talk about that. If you're very open and honest and transparent, and if you root what you're doing in your collections and history and the place, you're unlikely to face, you know, that much resistance from people who care about your collections and the history in the place. I think it is when people don't understand what you're doing, it feels different. They don't feel involved, they don't see the connection to what they care about in the place, that they kind of shut down and really sort of create opposition to what you're doing. But if you can kind of take them with you, then they can be huge advocates. And one of the things that happened certainly in the Kingston Lacey example I'm thinking of is you get a few really sort of early adopters, a few who are really keen and really get it, who'll come to everything, who'll kind of bring your volunteer cohort with you as well. So I think it is about, speaking openly, honestly, as early as possible and creating opportunities for them to contribute to what you're trying to do, so it doesn't feel like something separate or other or different to them. I don't know if there's anything else, Dan or Khris, you want to add to that?
I can just give a very quick example of my own experience where we didn't do it right, and what that looked like. And it's kind of just adding on to what you've already said, Rachael, but I did a bit of work with queering the collections for HRP at Hillsborough Castle, and I think we all got very caught up. We tried to organize a working group that everybody was welcome to come to, but nobody really came to it. So it was really just the curatorial and education team that were putting this together. And we launched the tour and it was very successful. And then we held a day where all the staff could come on the tour. And we experienced a lot of resistance from staff during the tour, and predominantly from the explainers or the tour guides who would do the kind of general tour. They gave a lot of pushback. And after a lot of conversation, we realized that they feel, in many ways, because they're so public facing, that they are kind of the keepers of the stories, and they felt a real ownership over those stories and over those collections after years of telling those stories. And suddenly we were telling them a new narrative that they felt they hadn't been part of, and they hadn't been allowed the chance to give their perspective. And as soon as that opportunity was given to them, they were behind it in the same way Rachael described there. So that is an example of how actually, whilst we left it open for them to join this working group, it maybe should have been a bit more formal than that. And actually we should have sat down with them and had that conversation. Now there's nuances to that as well. But I just wanted to tell that story and say that sometimes you can get it wrong, and that's okay. As long as you're prepared to try to resolve the situation as well. I don't know if Dan has anything else to add.
I think it comes back to that idea of legacy as well. You know, the longer you do it for, that trust establishes between that old guard and the new guard, and they start to kind of, you know, as they interact with each other more as volunteers or as staff, that trust develops between the two as well. And I think that it does set up over time that rich sort of sharing of experiences, or in an intergenerational exchange of ideas and learning as well. I've also noticed that there's a question that's coming from Manesi to kind of follow up on the question of religion, and it's whether to talk about the role of Christianity colonialism. And I wonder, Khris, if this is something that you might want to come in as well, because I see that there's lots of that work that is really significant to what's happening in Northern Ireland. But I think Christianity and colonialism, I think, yes, it does come up in lots of the work that is being done, because it is certainly something that, you know, on one hand, colonialism impacted so many countries around the world, where it introduced an anti-homosexual law in the world, which remains very much through to this day. You know, I think more than 70 countries in the world it's illegal to be homosexual. More than half of them are Commonwealth countries. There is a direct correlation there. And I think Christianity is that other element as well. So even if you're not looking at, say, the British Empire, and you look at elsewhere, French or Spanish or whatnot, that idea of the spread of Christianity also really impacted. And what's really interesting sometimes is that the nuance of what that has done to our understanding of what exists in history. So in terms of Christianity has very much obliterated the history. So if you go to source communities, sometimes they will say, no, that's not our history, when there were people who were actually observing at the time. So, you know, about 100 years ago, 50 years ago, lots of rituals that have elements of there's a sense of homosexual or understanding, or a difference in understanding of sexuality and gender. So I think that that's a really tricky thing to navigate sometimes, but it's a really important thing to navigate as well, because Christianity may have left an impact that still remains to this day, that makes it difficult to really connect to what was the story from the past. But Khris, I think more recent, there is been some really important work around I suppose what's happening in Northern Ireland and the two religions and queer history.
Yeah, I mean, Northern Ireland is a very complex place in a number of different ways. And I think that the intersection of religion and politics and identity here is something that will always cause problems. And particularly around LGBT and queer identity, it's one that's been sort of utilized as it's a bat to beat people with almost, you know, that you have these two conflicting sides in Northern Ireland, and LGBTQ plus rights have very much been embroiled in that conflict. It's quite complicated, but as you say, it's really interesting that Christianity is often used as a means to perpetuate injustice, and that's not something that a lot of Christians might relate to, but at a political level it can be used. And even to add on to what you said there, Dan, I had a real privilege to do a bit of work recently for the Chester Beatty, which is an amazing collection in Dublin, and they have a huge Eastern collection, Islamic, Japanese, Chinese, and it's the most stunning collection of objects. And it was the first time I'd really delved into that history, and it presented an opportunity to look at queer history without the kind of blurred vision of my own Western Christian perspectives. And actually, it was a chance to show people that certain identities have always existed, and that they have been suppressed in many ways by colonization, by the introduction of Christianity, by the oppression of other identities. But it's a chance to look back and say, well, actually, these have always existed, and it's giving people an identity. And I think the intersectionality between decolonization, LGBTQ plus rights, and queer heritage is a really fascinating one. And it's definitely one that is explored in the literature, as you say. But I think there's way more work to do on it, because we do naturally come at things, if you live here and grew up here, with a very Western perspective. So those collections, I think, are rich and are dying to be interpreted more and more and more. But yeah, really good question.
I'm reminded of what Richard O'Leary from LGBT Heritage Project in Northern Ireland sort of reminded me as well. Queerness can overcome everything. So to kind of give you something positive, which is Richard's history of Belfast, is that there was this area of Belfast that during the Troubles on a Friday night it would be evacuated, but the ones that would remain would be all the queers, and they would go out and hang out together. So they had run of the city suddenly after hours on a Friday night. The city was theirs. And they would hang out together, and of course, people would meet. But the thing that you never talked about was religion, because queerness overcame everything. So you come from, you can be Protestant or Catholic, but it was, so long as you were, queer and in a bar together, it was fine. So I think that was a rather sweet story.
I think that is the absolute perfect way to round off the session. Thank you to both of you who submitted questions, because I recognise both of your names. You've asked brilliant questions in several sessions so far, so thank you for those. I think, as I say, I think we're pretty much on the hour now. It's been fantastic. Thank you, Khris, Rachael and Dan. It's been a brilliant session, and repeating myself yet again, the session has been recorded. In a couple of weeks it will be available to watch back, and we'll make sure all the resources that were mentioned throughout the presentation are shared with you. But thank you everyone for joining us. Hope to see you at another session today. Thank you.
Thanks.